The world of extreme metal stood silent on December the 13th, 2001. It was the day when, unfortunately, one of their godfathers, Chuck Schuldiner, breathed his last breath, victimized by cancer. The cancer was found 2 years prior whenever Chuck was complaining about some pain in his neck, thinking originally that it was a bulging disc, either that or a pinched nerve. Chuck is seen as one of the most important figures of extreme metal, the godfather of death metal. His band Death, ironic, right, is considered to be one of the greatest of all time. The one that was actually within the classroom that was willing to expand and try to do more with the death metal genre instead of trying to repeat the same feat twice. Their last two albums, Symbolic and The Sound of Perseverance, were among some of the most creative that you're going to find from the early days of the death metal genre. Of course, these days we see a lot of creativity in death metal all the time. One could say that there's a huge debt to be owed to Chuck because of this. But this is the what-if game. We're wondering what would have happened if Chuck hadn't passed away. Many people have been wondering this, perhaps ever since it's happened. At the time, he was working on material for the second Control Denied album. Control Denied being sort of the logical follow-up to what Death was all about. So here we are. It's time for us to talk about what may have happened if Chuck had not passed away in 2001. But in order to do this, we actually have to go further back in history and change history. We have to go back to 1999. So let's get started. The very first thing that we have to do to change history and to actually make this a viable option is to go back to 1999 whenever Chuck goes to the doctor to check and see what's going on with his neck. See what the pain is all about. Whether it's a bulging disc or a pinched nerve, whatever it may be, it's certainly not cancer. Not this time. Not in this reality. In this reality, it simply is just a bulging disc or a pinched nerve. It's based around years of headbanging and just maybe an injury that would have occurred that seemed minor at the time but eventually developed into something that was major. Age is kind of a bitch. So based around this, some simple treatments, perhaps some medication, either that or maybe a minor surgery is able to take care of this problem and get Chuck back on his feet. He works on the second Control Denied album and they complete it in 2001. At this point in time, Control Denied really seems like it's primed to be Chuck's baby. He never really ruled out that death was never going to exist ever again, but it seemed like he was trying to sort of go a different path. His music was one that was expanding and becoming even more and more different and distant from what he initially had done with the band back whenever they first released Scream Bloody Gore in the middle portion of the 1980s. So it seemed only right for him to kind of go with in the direction that his music was taking him, which is why Control Denied was really formed. It was something that was very, very different, and the name isn't one that needed to be associated with death in order for it, you get the point. So with the second album, Control Denied gets a little bit more credibility. People start to realize who this is and what they're all about. Death fans, of course, are flocking to this album. They hear that it is a little bit different, and perhaps some of them are turned off by this. Perhaps some do turn away, but most of his classic fans still do remain. So with Control Denied, I see that this project would probably last into the middle portion of the 2000s, perhaps even later on into the 2000s, releasing a handful of albums. We're going to say 5, and as far as titles are concerned, really it's up to you what you think that they would be considered. However, I feel that Control Denied, their real importance to the scene would be based off of the creativity as it would continue to grow denser and denser. I think that around album number 3 or 4 you would actually see Chuck attempt to do two things. First of all, perhaps write something that's a bit conceptual, and I don't mean just a song, I mean a full album. And secondly, write a track along with his band that exceeds the 10-minute mark. In fact, one that may be a full-fledged suite, not full-blown prog like The Astonishing, but instead something that has a story to tell that doesn't take just 4 or 5 minutes to get it across. One that has a really dense meaning to it, perhaps one that has some deep philosophical or deep life-related reason behind it. Think about any great artist or any great songwriter that has a story that they wish to tell, but perhaps feel restricted by 3 to 4 minutes, and then you have that one song that's maybe 6 or 7, where it just feels like it's so much more to it than really anything else that that artist has really given. Consider what it would be like if a pop artist got the opportunity to give their manifesto on life in 8 minutes as opposed to just 3.5. And that's kind of what you got here. You have an individual who has a lot of great opinion and a lot of terrific stories to tell based off of his philosophies, based off of him being extremely literate and very fascinated by many aspects of this universe. If you consider the lyrics of The Sound of Perseverance as a whole, as exhibition of that alone, you start to realize that Chuck had a lot to say, and his lyrics were always exceptionally thought-provoking. So near the exit portion of the 2000s, moving into the 20-teens, I think that you're going to see the itch sort of return. And it's kind of not because Control Denied is basically going nowhere, because they're not. They have grown into a very respectable portion of the heavy metal community. They are liked and beloved by many, and a lot of the newcomers that are discovering death metal are now discovering other facets of heavy metal through Control Denied, through Chuck's secondary vision. So in reality, this is having a dual effect. It's having the effect of the original band getting folks into death metal, and perhaps being a nice, liaison into other bands within the genre, while Control Denied is doing the same thing with maybe a progressive side, either that or whatever you really want to call it. So now you have fans that are exploring even more. However, near the end point of this decade, you're going to see that itch come back, and that itch is for death to return. There's a real clamoring for this, and what's really spawning this and sort of egging it on is the fact that so many classic bands that have decided to part company are now starting to come back. Initially, Chuck decides to try to distance himself from this whole philosophy, feeling that it would really not be all of that genuine. However, eventually there would be clamoring for this, considering Death is one of the classic bands of this genre. And by 2011, you start to realize that you've had new albums by Morbid Angel, and a couple years later, we would of course have a new album from Obituary, but there's been clamorings of a reunion there. Cannibal Corpse is still going strong. Death needs to come back. It's something where many people feel they need to come back just to complete that sort of big four of death metal. And again, he still decides to sort of, distance himself from this idea until 2013. After one last Control Denied album, all of a sudden he hears that Carcass are coming back. Now, you're probably wondering why I think that Carcass would be the straw that broke the camel's back that would push him over the edge. I think it's based around the idea of how long it was between Carcass albums. I think that this would be the moment where he realizes, you know what? If they're able to do it after 20 years, we can definitely do this. We can definitely pull it off, and it's going to start to feel genuine. Throughout this whole couple-year cycle, you can feel that itch, you can feel that sort of desire slowly gaining within Chuck's blood. It's something where, even on that final Control Denied album prior to this Death reunion, it sounds like there's a lot more aggression that is being expelled, almost as though Chuck himself is even returning to the writing mindset of what some of Death's latter albums, or even some of their middle-of-the-road albums, such as, Infinite Thought Patterns, either that or Human, or Individual Thought Patterns, rather, or Human, really were propelling and sort of putting the groundwork for. So here we are, 2013, and Death is back. Death performs a couple of live shows, and then they announce the inevitable, that there would be a studio album. The studio album takes about a year and a half to actually manifest itself. They get back together with some of the classic members of the band, including Shannon Ham, and they're able to get things done. In late 2014, right around October-ish, we have a brand new Death album, and it's one that absolutely rips. Is this one that's necessarily on par with some of the classics that were delivered during the latter portion of this era? No, there's still something markedly different about it. Because once you start writing a certain way, and you just continue to explore, going back to something that may feel a little bit limiting, well, it's kind of hard to tell what exactly would happen. I'm thinking that this would be an album where Chuck would explore the death metal genre a little bit more, as opposed to just staying sort of pigeonholed within some of its tired convention. This is instead an album that I feel would be a terrific experience based around what Chuck could bring to the table after now having 13 years essentially, maybe even 14, to explore his vision in Control Denied. Here in 2016, we would be awaiting the follow-up album to that Death, return disc. And it would be something that would be coming out later this year. Chuck would still be in full force. There'd be no cancer. He may still have to, every so often, get some treatments for, a kink in the neck. Maybe he breaks a leg. Basic stuff. But we don't lose him. We don't lose him. Chuck's loss is one that is extremely huge, but it's also one that has propelled many people to explore death metal. Whether it be just as a genre to listen to or as a genre to perform. Really, he's somebody that has caused this not only with death metal, but just with heavy music in general, with extreme music in general. Kind of made it a real cool thing to make a statement. You know, do something a little bit different. Bleed the convention dry and try something brand new. His importance is what makes him immortal. His contributions do the exact same thing. Do you agree with this timeline? Do you feel that Chuck would still be with us here in 2016 if he hadn't passed away in 2001? Leave some of your counter arguments or some of your alternate timelines in the comments box below. I'm coverkillernation, and until we fire up the what if machine again, I thank you very much for watching this video, and I will see you next time.